Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Phillip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Callie Crosley is off. Tonight, missing black girls. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We're working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. It's every parent's nightmare, learning that their child has gone missing. According to the latest figures from the FBI's NCIC database, over 500,000 people were reported missing in 2021. Over 350,000 were children. Many of those cases were closed, but of the cases still open, more than 70,000 are missing black girls. Sadly, getting help and assistance in cases involving missing black girls can be non-existent versus cases involving white women, many becoming household names. Both are tragic, but the comparative inattention to missing black girls makes it doubly so. Experts say time is crucial when locating a missing child. So what more can be done to find missing black girls? Joining us remotely, Boston City Councilor Tania Fernandes Anderson, representing District 7, consisting of Roxbury, Dorchester, Fenway, and part of the South End. Rahsaan Hall, principal at Rahsaan Hall Consulting. He's also running for Plymouth County District Attorney. Alexandria Onuoha, Director of Political Advocacy at Black Boston and a PhD candidate in Applied Developmental Psychology at Suffolk University. And Gaétane Borders, President and CEO of Peas in Their Pods, a national organization based in Atlanta, advocating for missing children of color, their families, and to fight against child abuse and sexual exploitation. Welcome to all of you on this very sad topic, I'm afraid. Let's start by talking about missing. What exactly comprises, what is the criteria for establishing whether someone is missing? And Rahsaan, let me start with you on that question, because part of that definition obviously is legal, but part of it, of course, is also subjective. How would you describe that?
Well, thank you, Martin, and this is a very important topic. One of the requirements when law enforcement looks at it is a period of time that a person has not been able to be identified. In many instances, they'll look for 24 to 72 hours. But the thinking about why we need to have this conversation, particularly as it relates to Black girls and women, is the disparity that you mentioned, the understanding in society and the biases towards Black women that, Black women can bear more pain, are stronger, are capable of doing all things, and nothing phases them. Similarly, Black women and girls in particular are less likely to be understood as being vulnerable or able to be victims or being able to be exploited. And I think that leads to some of the significant disparities in the resources that get invested in making sure that Black girls and women are safe and are found, and that the value in the communities is higher so that the resources are invested there appropriately. But in many instances, law enforcement officials will say, well, maybe they're away for a period of time and they'll come back on their own. But when it becomes clear that all of the normal means of reaching out or identifying someone have failed, that they would then look to law enforcement to put out bulletins or start searching for people or start an investigation. And oftentimes people in the Black community are left wanting for more.
Alexandria, you extrapolated from the data on missing children, and in a piece for Commonwealth Magazine, you determined that this was, that data, and I think all our panelists agree, showed extraordinary disproportionate attention to girls of color. Can you talk about the data, what you found, and
yes,
and then also in the context of what Gwen Ifill, the late Gwen Ifill, PBS, called missing white woman syndrome?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And in that Commonwealth op-ed piece, I talked also about the interconnectedness of human trafficking and missing Black girls and how those are linked. And within the data, recently the FBI in 2020, they reported that Black women and girls were murdered 4 times per day. Like 4 Black women and girls were murdered per day in 2020. And then in 2018, there was over 64,000 Black women and girls missing in the United States, when 7% of the population compromises of Black women and girls. So we see that this disparity. And I also want to chime in here and say that data collection is really important. And going back to what Rahsaan said about, law enforcement and ethical protocols, a lot of that could be solved, in my opinion, is with proper data collection. Data allows us to figure out what demographics need that support, and it allows policy to be more directed, not necessarily individualized, because this is a multi-layered issue, but what it allows is data allows us to figure out where these issues are happening, and also the socioeconomic status and all of these other demographic information.
I'm going to look at I'm going to expand this in a second to talk about the national implications with you, Gaétane. But right now, I'd like to turn to the councilor to ask, let's micro focus for a second on some of areas where missing Black girls and Latina and Native American girls have been reported. Your district, can you talk about what you've seen and who you've heard from in basically trying to appeal to police, trying to appeal to the community to find these children?
Thank you, Phillip, so much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I think I would speak on more from the perspective of a foster parent. I fostered children for 11 years, and predominantly school-age children, but when I did foster teenagers, specifically girls, Latino or Black, who would go missing, and Ms. Alexandria is absolutely correct in her statement that it is directly correlated with sex trafficking or some sort of addiction or abuse. And it's devastating to know that the folks in our communities, as a Black woman, I would say that, we continue to be dehumanized and unappreciated, so that when we do go missing, it's almost forgotten. It's almost a thing of, oh, that's sad. And you see a social media post and everyone sort of bypasses it. And people post, people are compassionate about it. People express emotions, but we don't actually see the follow-up, right? And most of the time, as your statistics show, they go unresolved. From my experiences, it wasn't until the girls that went missing under my care were 18, and we are still in contact now, that I discovered where they were and what had taken place. And of course now going through therapy and hopefully recovery.
This is, as you said, a matter of definition for law enforcement agencies. Oftentimes, they use the term runaways when families might use the appropriate term missing, in order to prioritize these young women, these young girls. And Gaétane, your organization, and it's quite appropriate, peas in a pod. You're right. You focus on children who are missing. But children across the board of all colors and all races, ethnicities, but what you find is a disproportionate number are children of color. Not long ago, Georgia law enforcement, a task force that had been set up, a law enforcement task force, located 30 missing children, most of them children of color. What might have happened if your organization and others had not advocated heavily in order to, if you will, force this outcome?
Thank you so much for having me on today. This conversation is so important and impactful and has always been. This issue certainly is not a new issue. This epidemic, as we call it through our organization, has occurred for decades, right? So more recently, there's been more talk about it because of the missing white woman syndrome that has been talked about in circles. But this issue is it is so profound, and it would not occur if it weren't for so many different areas being problematic. Of course, we know, it goes without saying, systemic racism, bias is at the heart of it all. The issue of sex trafficking, which is the issue that you're referring to, that finding of those 40 some odd kids here in Georgia, those were kids that were specifically preyed upon. Within the African American Black children of color umbrella, those children are often targeted for a variety of reasons. Socioeconomic status is one of them. Research has shown that these traffickers often target these particular individuals because they're not covered by the law. They know that they can swoop and come in and take a child, a Black child, and they might not do any time for it, or it might go unnoticed, because these particular children sometimes don't have appropriate legal representation. They don't have recourse with the police. They literally are snatched off the street. And so traffickers are willing to do so because they know that typically the Black family does not have a voice that will be loud and will be heard, whether it's through the media or even in their own communities. So if it weren't for individuals like us on this panel talking about this, it would not raise awareness, because a big part of this is the reactive part to helping to find children. But the other most important part as well is the preventative measures. If we don't know that this is occurring, then we won't put proper things in place to help safeguard our communities and our children. If we're not represented in the media, then we're left to think that maybe it doesn't impact us, right? But the reality is 40% of children that go missing, 42% to be honest, of children that go missing are Black and brown, and they are not represented in the media by any means.
Those statistics are astounding, and and I hope that folks understand that this is an issue, again, as you pointed out, is also relates to human trafficking and drug addiction, so on and so forth. In Minnesota, you had Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who had proposed I think it was last December, a law creating a task force that would prioritize and first of all investigate and then prioritize missing Black and Native American girls. Minnesota has a large Native American community. To anyone on the panel, all of you in fact, what are your thoughts about creating local task force and statewide task force that prioritize finding missing Black and other children of color?
I think I can start off and say I am a proponent of that. In my op-ed, that was like one of the actionable items that I stated. And to your point, Representative Ruth Richardson is taking lead on that charge for that task force. And I think it's really important because this is, again, is a multi-layered issue. So not just one area of knowledge is crucial. We need youth practitioners, we need community organizers, we need our elected officials. So within Massachusetts, we have the Child Justice Unit, we also have the Human Trafficking Division, but we also have community organizers that have been talking about this since the beginning of time. And I think we cannot work in isolation. We have to work collaboratively to really address this issue. So I am a big believer of having task force and other things. Like this is a multi-layered issue, so it's not gonna be one solution, but I do think a task force where multiple people with different perspectives would be beneficial in promoting the well-being of Black girls.
Who else would like to opine on that? Councilor, let me ask you, I mean, you've dealt with this so personally. A task force on a local level, perhaps on a state level, your view about that?
I mean, I agree with Ms. Alexandra. I think it's a great idea as long as we have representation that represents demographics, as long as we have cultural competency, as long as we are making sure that we're not criminalizing young girls that go missing. I think that, you know, my only concern is that, you know, whenever we do something like this, it turns, you know, and it somehow connects to criminal justice system, that we are ensuring that it's a reformed approach, that it's not necessarily criminalizing, right? So with my experience, I've never heard of such thing. And at least in my practice now, or my job now, I am filing for a hearing to discuss sort of what is the after-school structure, or how is government supporting parents to support their children with whether it be mental behavioral health treatment plans or behavior modification charts and stuff like that. And I think that after-school structure and having support from our government with resources and understanding how to navigate them is severely important, right? So this is also supporting parents and understanding how to advocate for their children in the event that something does go wrong. So I support the task force, and I look forward to having more conversations about it as well.
And Rahsaan, the notion of these young girls not being criminalized, further criminalized, particularly those who have been victims and survivors of human trafficking, who have been reported missing. What do you see as an alternative path to guaranteeing that these young women are not criminalized? We know the laws have changed in Massachusetts, focused on the 2012 human trafficking reform bills and the new law that was enacted in 2012. But is there enough to guarantee the non-criminalization of missing Black children and other children of color?
Well, I think that's where the role of the prosecutor's office or the district attorney's office becomes critically important, to make sure that the assistant district attorneys that are seeing cases of young girls and young women who are coming before court with cases that are related to their experience of being trafficked, because sometimes it's not just the traditional charges of, sex for a fee or the prostitution, common night walker type of offenses, when in reality they are being trafficked, but the offenses that are pertinent to that, right? So if there's drug distribution charges that are a part of their trafficking, if they're struggling with substance use disorder, and so some form of evaluation and diversionary programs to ensure that people, to the counselor's point, aren't being criminalized. And that's one of the problems within the system writ large, is that we try to address too many of societal issues or society's issues through the criminal legal system and get terrible results. And so finding out what are the root causes, what is leading to young girls and women being trafficked in the first place, what are the unmet needs that exist, what resources need to be in our communities to ensure that people are not susceptible and vulnerable to being trafficked, what type of education needs to happen online. The number of people who are engaged in TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and connecting with people that they don't know, making sure that young women and girls, as well as young boys and young men, know about the problems and the risks of trafficking and are able to identify problematic behavior. But to your initial question, with the district attorney's office, ensuring that the staff is well trained and understands the issue and is in contact and conversation with people who are directly impacted, survivors of human trafficking, to explain what the experience is like, so you don't have a prosecutor sitting in a courtroom who has no idea what this issue is about, making decisions from a file folder that they received merely minutes before.
That passion that you just brought to this issue is one that our entire panel is bringing to this issue, and I think that is why the issue has come to the forefront, because it certainly is not because of folks, I'm afraid, in my profession, the media. The media has followed as opposed to being brought along. Gaétane, let me ask you a question. That this case, we had a local case here that may sound familiar for you. A young woman named Cheryl, I think it's Cheryl Pringle, Woburn, went missing, and it was her family. It was her family that basically did the groundwork, the legwork, tracking her phone, finding out who she last saw, and finally discovering, sadly, tragically, that this young woman had been killed in I think it was in Stoughton. They found her body in Stoughton. And I'm just wondering, how familiar is that particular case to you? Does it resonate when you think about this issue and the work you're doing nationwide?
It resonates greatly. And it's so sad to say that this young woman's story is one that is repeated daily, sadly to say. And most oftentimes Black families find themselves in the same circumstance that her family found themselves. So it's self-advocating, knowing what to do. And that's the problem, is that most families don't know what to do. They were better equipped. And so they, did what they could do to help find her. And it was a tragic ending. But so many Black families, they face a brick wall immediately upon even reporting their loved one missing. The response that they get from law enforcement is one that you would never want to receive when your mother, your sister, your child is missing and you can't find them. Let me give you an example of some of the hardships our families face, the ones that we work with. They will call. And now keep in mind, there is no law that says you have to wait to report your child missing. There's no law. But yet, sometimes when they call law enforcement, they'll be told, the last case I worked with, they told the mom to come back in 72 hours. 72 hours. Let that resonate. Anybody who knows anything about the missing knows that every second matters. So 72 hours to wait and come back. What would have happened to that child in those 72 hours is inconceivable. But this is the type of response that they're getting oftentimes from law enforcement. So it leaves the family on their own, or to seek out nonprofits like myself or advocates for their assistance to help them break down those walls, or also search for their loved ones.
And you've done this in part through something called the Aurelia Alert, am I correct? Can you talk about that briefly?
Yes, so the Aurelia Alert is named after a young little girl who went missing in Florida called Aurelia Wilson. Her name is actually an acronym. It stands for Remember, I Love You Always. And years ago, when we realized that oftentimes people of color, children of color, don't get the alert system, the Amber Alert system that we all know so well, which is a wonderful system. But for whatever reason, children of color don't seem to reach the criteria necessary to trigger that alert system. At the time that we decided to do our own alert system, it was really when social media started taking hold and had a life of its own. So we realized that we could use social media to help spread awareness quickly for the missing loved ones, the missing children of the families with whom we work. So we started that alert system in Aurelia's honor because, as we say for our organization, it's everyone's job to help save our children. And no child should go missing in secrecy. Whenever someone goes missing, everybody needs to know. If you don't know that they're missing, how can you help? So that was the premise, and that's why we put out the Riley Alert for our missing children.
Okay, we are counting down quickly to the end of our show, and I'd like to know from each of you, in sort of a billboard type of way, what's next? What do we do as a society to guarantee that children who go missing are found, and that the society is alerted, and that they are prioritized along with every other child who goes missing? Councilor, why don't we start with you? Again, the billboard, what's next?
I think that, we have to be intentional about the strategy. We have to be intentional about making sure that we are treating this just as valuable, as important as a white woman when she goes missing. I think that it's education for the parents, but it's also, it's not for us to blame the victim or to shame the families of the victims, right? So I think that we have to legislatively raise some sort of effort to ensure that our criminal justice system is doing their job, and that we have to campaign around destigmatizing when young girls go missing, especially Black girls, that we are not just sex objects, and that if we are missing, that we are just as human and valuable and loved and deserve as much attention. And so education, awareness, and tools that we can aid families, yes, but definitely I think that it's for our criminal justice system to hold them accountable to do a better job on this issue.
Thank you. Alexandria, your billboard, 30 seconds.
Yes, so I have two. So the first one is similar to Councilor in that we need that education. So that task force would be really beneficial. And I think if everyone has an understanding of interlocking systems of oppression that subjugate Black girls, I think we would be far along. And then the second approach is to me, it goes beyond missing Black girls. We're talking about missing Black girls, but we're really talking about social supports. And we're talking about youth practitioners, educators, inquiring about how your day is going, simple things like that, and really coming from a place of centering care and love. And I think that goes a long way. So I would say educators, youth practitioners, as well as us having that task force that is a collaborative effort.
Excellent. Rahsaan, 30 seconds.
I think the biggest takeaway, they say, what is it? The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And there is a significant barrier that we have to overcome, which is the devaluing of Black lives. And that's why when Black girls go missing, there's not the level of investment in ensuring that they're considered missing, but then too, that they are found. But I think the way that we overcome that is continuing to hold our institutions accountable to be responsive and responsible and accountable to the Black community and communities of color and communities that have historically been overlooked and marginalized. And so holding the media accountable to ensure that they are telling the stories of these Black girls, holding our educational institutions responsible for ensuring that our children and young people are being educated on the dangers and threats around there, and making sure that law enforcement from police and prosecutors' offices are being well trained and equipped on identifying these issues.
Okay, well, look, I appreciate it. And Gaétane, we will talk with you on the other side of our program and Facebook. That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. We want to thank you for joining us. Now, stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Phillip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. We are on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on missing Black girls. And again, one of the questions that dawned on me, and I'm sure this is something the three of you think about all the time, is the role of culture in basically normalizing missing children. And treating them as runaways. And part of that normalization, if you will, takes place in popular music, where the notion of a pimp and the Mac is still idolized, regardless of the fact that we are in a, if you will, considered an area where Me Too and Time Out have become common terms and practices. You still see if you will, the inferiorization of Black girls and girls of color across the board in terms of popular culture. Does that play a role in how Black girls who are missing are basically seen and framed in these discussions? Gaétane, I'm going to start with you in that respect.
Sure. Well, I think it definitely helps to fuel the sexualization of Black girls and women, of course. I don't think that anything occurs by itself. It's the intersection of the sexualization as well as the intersection of racism and bias, and all of that, in addition to other things, of course, creates this ball where it becomes easy for some to devalue women, Black women and children, and allow for certain things, turn a blind eye because Black women are deemed to be stronger or more capable to cope with certain things. And Black girls, well, maybe they deserved it, or maybe they're out there and they are, just bad kids. Whereas white girls are seen as vulnerable. White women are seen as women in distress and that need protection and support. So all of that together, I don't think rap music leads to it. I think all of it together, the concept, the conceptualization of what a Black woman is and what she needs and whether or not she needs help, all of it together is problematic. But at the heart is certainly bias and racism.
And you're right about the intersectionality of these issues. Rahsaan, you said something I thought was really interesting, and it's something I thought about prior to today's show. The notion of Black Lives Matter, for some people, has become controversial, and they will respond, well, all lives matter. But The fact of the matter is, when you're talking about Black girls missing, there's a disproportionate attention to those Black lives. If you're, you could juxtapose that in many ways to the way that we are correctly focused on Ukraine. But when you think about Black refugees or immigrants, their lives are seen again as less than by comparison. And I make that juxtaposition because of the broader issue of Black lives not seeming to matter, whether it be in immigration, in a comparative sense, or whether it be in terms of missing Black children. Is that a fair observation?
It's absolutely a fair observation. And the crisis in Ukraine has revealed it. We've seen, thankfully for Black Twitter, we've seen the instances of Black immigrants in the Ukraine being denied safe passage out of the country and being treated with disdain and disrespect. The fact that Brittany Griner is missing and no one is talking about it because she's been detained in Russia and it's not a top headline story. Let that have been a white woman who was, an Olympic gold medalist for the U.S. ski team, right? Or a champion swimmer, or Sue Bird, a WNBA player. It would have been a very different conversation. And to your point around Black Lives Matter being controversial, because it's been politicized and it's been co-opted by the right to be turned into something that it's not. But the thing that I found most persuasive for people is, this analogy of a house being on fire and the fire department responding to put water on that house and the neighbor saying, but my house matters too. Yeah, but your house ain't on fire. And so the situation in our communities, the disappearance rates of our Black girls, that means our house is on fire and we need people to pay attention to it. It doesn't mean that the other houses don't matter, but we need to respond to the crisis where it exists.
The house is on fire, and Alexandria, you sent out an alarm in terms of your article, your op-ed for Commonwealth magazine. What type of response? How did people respond to that alarm going off? Especially the parents and relatives of missing children and women.
Yeah, I was nodding a lot because Rahsaan, you basically said what I was experiencing. I got a lot of DMs saying, well, you're highlighting Black women and girls, but what about everybody else? And it's like, yes, two things can be true at the same time. Yes, violence against women in general is a public health issue. Like no one's arguing against that. But what I'm saying is that the nuance that you're looking for is that Black women and girls have his history of not being seen, and also when they experience violence, where is the recovery? There's the nuance. Those are the nuances. Like what happens to them when they experience it? What support is available? And honestly, there's not a lot of support. So that's the nuance people are looking for. And I also think, thinking about digital media, going to your initial question, thinking about digital media and social media, I agree with Gaétane in that it's a bunch of things. And I also want to acknowledge that within social media, the hypersexualization and the adultification of Black women and Black girls in particular, like from a developmental standpoint, it's like physically, if Black girls are showing, puberty at increasing rates, that doesn't necessarily mean they are still children. That is still a child, and people need to understand that. And I think that is what kind of enrages me a little bit, is that yes, Black girls can appear to be a certain way, but they are children and they deserve protection. And then another point that I'm constantly thinking about when we think about devaluing Black women and girls, if we look at the case of Lauren Smith, she was 23 years old when she passed. And if you look at that case and you look at how they depicted her versus the white man that she was with, it's very different. So they depicted him in this photo hiking and, being with one in nature. But the picture that they decided to depict her, not necessarily this one, but there was another one where she was wearing a more provocative clothing. And I always say Black women can dress how they want to, but the media decided to emphasize that point to justify the lack of protection. And I think that is another issue, is that when it is covered, it's covered in an intentional way, in again, it does not promote the well-being of Black girls.
This is another, the case you just cited is extraordinarily controversial. You're right. The coverage, I would definitely argue, was hypersexualized in terms of describing this young woman. And her case did not rise to the fore, for example, national news, until once again, something that you, Gaétane and Rahsaan pointed out, until people started advocating for her on her behalf. This is a case out of Connecticut that few people seem to have paid attention to again until it was raised by her family. Gaétane, can you talk about, Peas in Their Pod covers a wide breadth of missing children and missing women. These cases, and again, the one that was just illustrated, how does it rise to the top of priorities, if you will? It doesn't happen. In other words, what is the process? Is it organic? Or again, this is something that only happens when, or by and large, only happens when the parents or the family or the children of these young women advocate on their behalf?
Great question. And the issue is that they don't rise up to significance. And the vast majority, 99.99999%, don't get any kind of leverage or coverage. Why? Because of the narrative that's placed on these missing women, children, boys, and men that, even in looking at the picture that was just displayed, the narrative is that maybe she did something to cause it. And so then why should we care, right? That's how detrimental it is. So what we have to do, sadly, and it's so tiresome, and I always tell families when we work with them, is that as tiresome as it is, you have to advocate for your missing loved one. Because right now, as it is, you are going to encounter brick wall after brick wall after brick wall after brick wall, because society does not place a lot of importance on our missing, our Black and brown missing. So those that do get some media coverage, sometimes it's the families and it's the work of advocates that really help to pound down those doors. But then sometimes you'll have a case like Felicia Barnes, who was a missing 16-year-old who was, high achieving. She was set to graduate high school early, beautiful young Black girl who went missing in Baltimore, Maryland about 10 years ago. And that case was one of the few cases involving missing Black children that got some national coverage, some international coverage as well. She was on the cover of People magazine, but people were able to draw somehow, some way. They were able to compare her to the missing girl next door. So that was a lot of the title involving her articles, the other missing girl next door, so it had to be something like that where it was in your face, like she is perfect, literally on paper, the sweetest kid, all A, set to go to college early, beautiful, dimples, artistic, all these things, nothing negative to say. Now what? Why aren't you covering her? And the moon and the sun aligned for her. But for one Felicia Barnes, there are hundreds and thousands of others that do not get media coverage. And there's been research done on it. Even though Black children, children of color, make up such a large percentage of those that go missing, despite our percentage here in the United States as a people, they receive the least media coverage, like a fraction of media coverage. And we know that coverage is what's needed to spread awareness and to help find these missing people. Without it, it's an uphill battle. But it's one where we, again, say, don't get tired, because we're only just starting to spread awareness, and it's going to be an uphill battle, but we can make it.
Can you tell us what happened to Felicia Barnes?
Sadly, so let me back up to say that, like so many missing Black children, she was labeled as a runaway on her police report. This was in December in Baltimore, Maryland. It's freezing cold. Her boots and her coat were found in the apartment. But the narrative, again, was that she left on her own, barefoot, in the cold, in Baltimore, Maryland, a couple days after Christmas. Her family advocated hard, but sadly, they found Felicia's body floating in the river. A few months later, she had been raped and murdered And so that was the unfortunate ending to finding her.
And there are so many unfortunate endings and that don't have to end this way. If, again, police are responsive, if law enforcement is responsive, if communities are responsive. I'd like to thank our panelists and just ask you, again, sort of a round table response, if you will, your personal thoughts on the missing, on children, young women who are basically our asterisks in our thinking of missing people, if you will. Women of color, girls of color. What are your final thoughts in terms of how we should process this as communities, if you will? It's heavy, isn't it? Rahsaan?
It is.
Yeah.
I would say
Oh, go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
Okay. I think my heart is heavy for those families who have lost loved ones and who are still missing, and for those who have loved ones who have gone missing and have found the unfortunate reality of their death and or murder. I think as a society, we have to do better with placing value on Black lives. I think as a society, men have to be held to a higher level of account. These aren't instances of Black girls being taken or kidnapped by other women. It's men who are the problem here. And there's a lot of education and accountability that needs to happen here. And there needs to be a greater level of love and embracing for the beauty and the richness and the vibrancy and the innocence of our girls.
Gaétane, you were about to say something, and then we'll have our final word from Alexandria.
Sure. I'll never forget the very first conversation I had with the mom whose 3 children were taken. And to this day, I can hear her screaming through the phone, her crying. And it's a conversation, it's a tone that I've heard multiple times throughout the 15 years of being an advocate. For me, it all revolves around spreading awareness because there is an epidemic. Our children and our women are being preyed upon. And it's serious. It's not something where we have the ability to look away. We shouldn't. We shouldn't look away because it's a silent killer of our people. And so spreading awareness, because awareness is key and representation is key. If we don't know that it's happening, we can't do things to prevent it. So awareness, but then also the back end of that is holding those in power accountable. That means law enforcement, they are accountable. They do not get a pass. They cannot put up brick walls just because they felt like it that day. We have to hold these entities accountable, and there has to be conversation between the states because each state can put up their own practices, but if there's no consistency across the state, then what have we done, really? So accountability and awareness for sure.
Thank you, Gaétane. Alexandria.
Yeah, this is really heavy. And as someone who community organized is in Boston, I'm thinking about the family members that Black Boston we talked to and trying to locate Black girls. And I think for me, one of the things that I'm walking away with this is, number one, is that community support is really beneficial, but we need community support and our elected officials and our law enforcement to also be in this role of advocating and spreading awareness. We also need to figure out what are the reporting protocols, who's validating them, who's saying it's effective, and whoever's saying that, are they people that look like marginalized communities in that room? Like who's responsible for the validating processes of reporting? Like how do we make sure that's effective? And I think for me, for Black Boston, I think one of the things that we're leaning into for next steps is really leaning into that community support. Are there events? Are there programming that we can do to make sure that Black girls feel loved and supported? And I think that's really important within this conversation. And the last thing I want to say is that we've had community organizers since the beginning of time talking about this. We've had the Combahee River Collective in 1979 organizing a march about missing Black girls and murdered Black girls and women in Boston Common. We're in 2022 now, And I'm grateful for organizations like Peas in a Pod, Our Black Girls, all of these other beautiful organizations, but there's still work to be done. And I'm just grateful that I was on this panel and got to talk to all of you about this. This is probably a highlight of my day, and thank you.
And I thank you. I thank you, Alexandria, Gaétane, and you, Rahsaan. All of you are contributing vitally. We're to try to change that headline from missing to safe and found. Thank you very much.